J.G. Ballard, The Drowned World, Chapter 2, The Coming of the Iguanas. Screeching like a dispossessed banshee, a large hammer-nosed bat soared straight out of one of the narrow inlets off the creek and swerved straight toward the cutter. Its sonar confused by the labyrinth of giant webs spun across the inlet by the colonies of wolf spiders, it missed the wire hood above Keren's head by only a few feet, and then sailed away along the line of submerged office blocks, gliding in and out of the huge sail-like fronds of the fern trees, sprouting from their roofs. Suddenly, as it passed one of the projecting cornices, a motionless stone-headed creature snapped out and plucked the bat from the air. There was a brief, piercing squawk, and Keren's caught a glimpse of the crushed wings clamped in the lizard's jaw. Then the reptile shrank back invisibly among the foliage. All the way down the creek, perched in the windows of the office blocks and department stores, the iguanas watched them go past, their hard-frozen heads jerking stiffly. They launched themselves into the wake of the cutter, snapping at the insects dislodged from the airweed and the rotting logs, then swam through the windows and clambered up the staircases to their former vantage points, piled 3 deep across each other. Without the reptiles, the lagoons and the creeks of office blocks, half submerged in the immense heat, would have had a strange dreamlike beauty. But the iguanas and basilisks brought the fantasy down to earth. As their seats in the one-time boardrooms indicated, the reptiles had taken over the city. Once again, they were the dominant form of life. Looking up at the ancient, impassive faces, Keren's could understand the curious fear they roused, rekindling archaic memories of the terrifying jungles of the Paleocene, when the reptiles had gone down before the emergent mammals, and sensed the implacable hatred one zoological class feels towards another that usurps it. At the end of the creek, they entered the next lagoon, a wide circle of dark green water, almost half a mile in diameter. A lane of red plastic buoys marked a channel towards an opening on the far side. The cutter had a draft of little more than a foot, and as they moved along through the flat water, the sun slanting down behind them, opening up the submerged depths, they could see the clear outlines of 5- and 6-story buildings looming like giant ghosts, here and there a moss-covered roof breaking the surface as the swell rose past. 60 feet below the cutter, a straight grey promenade stretched away between the buildings, the remains of some former thoroughfare, the rusting humped shells of cars still standing by the curb. Many of the lagoons in the centre of the city were surrounded by an intact ring of buildings, and consequently little silt had entered them. Free of vegetation apart from a few drifting clumps of sargasso weed, the streets and shops had been preserved almost intact, like a reflection in a lake that has somehow lost its original. The bulk of the city had long since vanished, and only the steel-supported buildings of the central commercial and financial areas had survived the encroaching floodwaters. The brick houses and single-story factories of the suburbs had disappeared completely below the drifting tides of silt. Where these broke surface, giant forests reared up into the burning, dull green sky, smothering the former wheat fields of temperate Europe and Northern America. Impenetrable Mato Grossos, sometimes 300 feet high, they were a nightmare world of competing organic forms, returning rapidly to their Paleozoic past, and the only avenues of transit for the United Nations military units were through the lagoon systems that they had superimposed themselves on the former cities. But even these were now being clogged with silt and then submerged. Keren's could remember the unending succession of green twilights that had settled behind them as he and Riggs moved slowly northwards across Europe, leaving one city after another, the miasmic vegetation swamping the narrow canals and crowding from rooftop to rooftop. Now they were to abandon yet another city. Despite the massive construction of the main commercial buildings, it consisted of little more than 3 principal lagoons, surrounded by a nexus of small lakes 50 yards in diameter, and a network of narrow creeks and inlets which wound off roughly following the original street plan of the city into the outlying jungle. Here and there they vanished altogether, expanded into the steaming sheets of open water that were the residues of the former oceans. In turn, these gave way to the archipelagos that coalesced to form the solid jungles of the southern massif. The military base set up by Riggs and his platoon, which harboured the biological testing station, was in the most southerly of the three lagoons, sheltered by a number of the tallest buildings of the city, 30-storey blocks in what had once been the downtown financial sector. As they crossed the lagoon, the yellow-striped drum of the floating base was on its sunward side, almost obscured in the reflected light, the rotating blades of the helicopter on its roof throwing brilliant glances towards the smaller white-painted hull of the biological testing water at them. 200 yards downshore was the smaller white-pointed hull of the biological testing station, moored against the broad humpback building which had formerly been a concert hall. Kerens gazed up at the rectangular cliffs, enough of the windows intact to remind him of the illustrations of sun-dazzled promenades at Nice, Rio and Miami he had read about as a child in the encyclopedias at Camp Bird. Curiously, though, despite the potent magic of the lagoon worlds and the drowned cities, he had never felt any interest in their contents and never bothered to identify which of the cities he was stationed in. Dr. Bodkin, 25 years his senior, had actually lived in several of them, both in Europe and America, and spent most of his spare time punting around the remoter waterways, searching out former libraries and museums. Not that they contained anything other than his memories. Perhaps it was this absence of personal memories that made Kerens indifferent to the spectacle of these sinking civilizations. He had been born and brought up entirely with what he once had been known as the Arctic Circle, now a subtropical zone with an annual mean temperature of 85 degrees, and had come southward only on joining one of the ecological surveys in his early 30s. The vast swamps and jungles had been a fabulous laboratory, the submerged cities little more than elaborate pedestals. Apart from a few older men such as Bodkin, there was no one who remembered living in them, and even during Bodkin's childhood, the cities had been beleaguered citadels, hemmed in by enormous dikes and disintegrated by panic and despair, reluctant Venices to their marriage with the sea. Their charm and beauty lay precisely in their emptiness, in the strange junction of two extremes of nature, like a discarded crown overgrown by wild orchids. The succession of gigantic geophysical upheavals which had transformed Earth's climate had made their first impact some 60 or 70 years earlier. A series of violent and prolonged solar storms lasting several years, caused by a sudden instability in the sun, had enlarged the Van Allen belts and diminished the Earth's gravitational hold upon the outer layers of the ionosphere. As these vanished into space, depleting the Earth's barrier against the full impact of solar radiation, temperatures began to climb steadily. The heated atmosphere expanding outwards into the ionosphere where the cycle was completed. All over the world, mean temperatures rose by a few degrees each year. The majority of tropical areas rapidly became uninhabitable, entire populations migrating north or south from temperatures of 130 and 140 degrees. Once temperate areas became tropical, Europe and North America sweltering under continuous heat waves, temperatures rarely falling below 100 degrees. Under the direction of the United Nations, the colonization began of the Antarctic Plateau and of the north borders of the Canadian and Russian continents. Over this initial period of 20 years, a gradual adjustment of life took place to meet the altered climate. A slackening of the previous tempo was inevitable, and there was little spare energy available to cut back the encroaching jungles of the equatorial region. Not only was the growth of all plant form accelerated, but the higher levels of radioactivity increased the rate at which mutations occurred. The first freak botanical forms appeared, recalling the giant tree ferns of the Carboniferous period, and there was a drastic upsurge of all lower plant and animal forms. The arrival of these distant forebears was overlaid by the second major geological upheaval. The continued heating of the atmosphere had begun to melt the polar ice caps. The entrained ice seas of the Antarctic plateau broke and dissolved. Tens of thousands of glaciers around the Arctic Circle from Greenland and northern Europe, Russia and North America poured themselves into the sea. Millions of acres of permafrost liquefied into gigantic rivers. Here again, the rise of global water levels would have been little more than a few feet, but the huge discharging channels carried with them billions of tons of topsoil. Massive deltas formed at their mouths, extending the continental coastlines and damming up the oceans. Their effective spread shrank from 2/3 of the Wales area to only slightly more than half. Driving the submerged silt before them, the new seas completely altered the shape and contours of the continents. The Mediterranean contracted into a system of inland lakes. The British Isles was linked again with northern France. The Middle West of the United States, filled by the Mississippi as it had drained the Rocky Mountains, became an enormous gulf opening into Hudson Bay, while the Caribbean Sea was transformed into a desert of silt and salt flats. Europe became a system of giant lagoons, centered on the principal low-lying cities, inundated by the silt, carried southwards by the expanding rivers. During the next 30 years, the poleward migration of populations continued. A few fortified cities defied the rising water levels and the encroaching jungles, building elaborate seawalls around their perimeters, but one by one these were breached. Only within the former Arctic and Antarctic circles was life tolerable. The oblique incidence of the sun's rays provided a shield against the more powerful radiation. Cities on higher ground in mountainous areas near the equator had been abandoned despite their cooler temperatures because of the diminished atmospheric protection. It was this last factor which provided its own solution to the problem of resettled migrant populations of the new Earth. The steady decline in mammalian fertility and the growing ascendancy of amphibian and reptile forms best adapted to an aquatic life in the lagoons and the swamps inverted the ecological balances, and by the time of Keren's birth at Camp Bird, a city of 10,000 in northern Greenland, it was estimated that fewer than 5 million people were still living on the polar caps. The birth of a child had become a comparative rarity, and only one marriage in 10 yields any offspring. As Keren's sometimes reminds himself, the genealogical tree of mankind was systematically pruning itself, apparently moving backwards in time, and a point might ultimately be reached where a second Adam and Eve found themselves alone in a new Eden. Riggs noticed him smiling to himself at this conceit. "What's amusing you, Robert? Another of your obscure jokes? Don't try to explain it to me." "I was just casting myself in a new role." Keren's looked out over the ramp at the office box, sliding past 20 feet away, the wash from the cutter splashing through the open windows along the waterline. The sharp tang of wet lime contrasted freshly with the oversweet odours of the vegetation. Macready had taken them into the shadow of the buildings, and it was pleasantly cool behind the breaking spray. Across the lagoon, he could see the portly, bare-chested figure of Dr. Bodkin on the starboard bridge of the testing station, the paisley cummerbund around his waist and the green cellulite shade shielding his eyes, making him look like a riverboat gambler on his morning off. He was plucking the orange-sized berries from the ferns overhanging the station and tossing them up at the chattering marmosets dangling from the branches above his head, egging them on with playful shouts and whistles. 50 feet away, on a projecting cornice, a trio of iguanas watched with stony disapproval, whipping their tails slowly from side to side in a gesture of impatience. Macready swung the tiller, and they pivoted in a fan of spray into the lee of a tall, white-faced building which lifted a full 20 stories out of the water. The roof of an adjacent smaller block served as a jetty, next to which was moored a rusty white-hulled power cruiser. The raked perspex windows of the driving cabin were cracked and stained, and the exhaust vents leaked a scaly oil into the water. As the cutter jockeyed in behind the power cruiser under Macready's expert hand, they clambered over to the wire door, jumped down onto the jetty and crossed a narrow metal gangway that led into the apartment block. The walls of the corridor were slick with moisture, huge patches of mould festering on the plaster. But the elevator was still working, powered by an emergency diesel. They rose slowly towards the roof and stepped out onto the upper level of the duplex, then walked down a service corridor to the outer deck. Directly below them was the lower level, a small swimming pool with a covered patio, bright deck chairs drawn up in the shade by the diving board. Yellow Venetian blinds masked the windows around 3 sides of the pool, but through the vanes they could see the cool shadows in the interior lounge, the glint of cut glass and silver on the occasional tables. In the dim light, under the striped blue awning at the rear of the patio, was a long chromium counter, as inviting as an air-conditioned bar seen from the dusty street, glasses and decanters reflected in the diamond-paned mirror. Everything in this private haven seemed clean and discreet, thousands of miles away from the fly-blown vegetation and tepid jungle water 20 stories below. Beyond the far end of the pool, screened by an ornamental balcony, was a wide open view of the lagoon, the city emerging from the Ocotian jungle. Flat sheets of silver water expanding towards the green blur along the southern horizon. Massive silk banks lifted their backs through the surface, a light yellow fur along their spines marking the emergence of the first giant bamboo groves. The helicopter rose from its platform on the roof of the base and arced upwards into the air towards them, the pilot swinging the tail as he changed direction, then roared overhead, 2 men in the open hatchway searching the rooftops with binoculars. Beatrice Dahl lay back on one of the deck chairs, her long, oiled body gleaming in the shadows like a sleeping python. The pink-tipped fingers of one hand rested lightly on an ice-filled glass on the table beside her, while the other hand turned slowly through the pages of a magazine. Wide blue-black sunglasses hid her smooth, sleek face, but Kerens noted the slightly sudden pout of her firm lower lip. Presumably Riggs had annoyed her, forcing her to accept the logic of his argument. The Colonel paused at the rail, looking down at the beautifully supple body with ungrudging approval. Noticing him, Beatrice pulled off her sunglasses, then tightened the loose black straps of her bikini under her arms, her eyes glinting quietly. "All right, you two, get on with it. I'm not a strip show." Riggs chuckled and trotted down the white metal stairs, Kerens at his heels, wondering how he was going to persuade Beatrice to leave their private sanctuary. "My dear Miss Dahl, you should be flattered that I keep coming to see you," Riggs told her, lifting back the awning and sitting down on one of the chairs. "Besides, as the military governor of this area," here he winked playfully at Kerens, "I have certain responsibilities towards you, and vice versa." Beatrice regarded him briefly with a jaundiced eye and reached out to turn up the volume of the radiogram behind her. "Oh, God," she muttered. Less polite imprecations under her breath and looked up at Kerens. "What about you, Robert? What brings you out so early in the day?" Kerens shrugged, smiling at her amiably. "I missed you." "Good boy. I thought perhaps that the Gauleiter here had been trying to frighten you with his horror stories." "Well, he has, as a matter of fact." Kerens took the magazine propped against Beatrice's knee and leafed through it idly. It was a 40-year-old issue of Paris Vogue, from its icy pages evidently kept somewhere in cold storage. He dropped it on the green tiled floor. B, it looks as if we'll all have to leave here in a couple of days' time. The Colonel and his men are pulling out for good. We can't very well stay on after he's gone. We? She repeated dryly. I didn't know there was any chance of you staying behind. Kerens glanced involuntarily at Riggs, who was watching him steadily. There isn't, he said firmly. You know what I mean. There'll be a lot to do in the next 48 hours. Try not to complicate things by making a last emotional stand. Before the girl could cut back at Kerens, Riggs added smoothly, The temperature is still going up, Miss Dahl. You won't find it easy to stand 130 degrees when the fuel for your generator runs out. The big equatorial rain belts are moving northward, and they'll be here in a couple of months. When they leave and the cloud cover goes, the water in that pool, she indicated the tank of steaming insect-strewn fluid, will damn well nearly boil. What with the type X anopheles, skin cancers, and the iguanas shrieking all night down below, you'll get precious little sleep. Closing his eyes, he added pensively, that is, assuming that you still want any. At this last remark, the girl's mouth fretted slightly. Kerens realised the quiet ambiguity in Riggs's voice when he asked how the biologist slept had not been directed at his relationship with Beatrice. The Colonel went on. In addition, some of the human scavengers driven northward out of the Mediterranean lagoons won't be too easy to deal with. Beatrice tossed her long black hair over one shoulder. I'll keep the door locked, Colonel. Irritated, Karen snapped. For God's sake, Beatrice, what are you trying to prove? These self-destructive impulses may be amusing to play with now, but when we've gone, they won't be so funny. The Colonel's only trying to help you. He doesn't really give a hoot whether you stay behind or not. Riggs let out a brief laugh. Well, I wouldn't say that. But if the thought of my personal concern worries you so much, Miss Dahl, you can just put it down to my overdeveloped sense of duty. That's interesting, Colonel, Beatrice commented sarcastically. I've always understood that our duty was to stay on here as long as possible and make every sacrifice necessary to that end. Or at least, here the familiar gleam of sharp humour crossed her eyes, that was the reason my grandfather was given when the government confiscated most of his property. She noticed Riggs peering over his shoulder at the bar. What's the matter, Colonel? Looking for your punkawalla? I'm not going to get you a drink if that's what you're after. I think you men only came up here to booze. Riggs stood up. All right, Miss Dahl, I give in. I'll see you later. He saluted Beatrice with a smile. Sometime tomorrow I'll send the cutter over to collect your gear, Miss Dahl. When Riggs had gone, Kerens lay back in his chair, watching the helicopter circling over the adjacent lagoon. Now and then it dived along the water's edge, the downdraft from its rotor blades beating through the flapping fronds of the fern trees, driving the iguanas across the rooftops. Beatrice brought a drink from the bar and sat down on the chair at his feet. I wish you wouldn't analyse me in front of that man, Robert. She handed him the drink and then leaned against his knees, resting her chin on one wrist. Usually she looked sleek and well-fed, but her expression today seemed tired and wistful. I'm sorry, Kerens apologised. Perhaps I was really analysing myself. Riggs' ultimatum came as a bit of a surprise. I wasn't expecting it to leave so soon. You are going to leave then? Kerens paused. The automatic player in the radiogram switched from Beethoven's Pastoral to the seventh, Toscanini giving way to Bruno Walter. All day without a break, it played through the cycle of 9 symphonies. He searched for an answer, the change of mood to the sombre opening motif of the 7, overlaying his indecision. I suppose I want to, but I haven't yet found an adequate reason. Satisfying one's emotional needs isn't enough. There's got to be a more valid motive. Perhaps these sunken lagoons simply remind me of the drowned world of my uterine childhood. If so, the best thing is to leave straight away. Everything Riggs says is true. There's little hope of standing up to the rainstorm and the malaria. He placed his hand on her forehead, feeling her temperature like a child. What did Riggs mean when he said you wouldn't sleep well? That was the second time this morning he mentioned it. Beatrice looked away for a moment. Oh, nothing. I've just had 1 or 2 peculiar nightmares recently. A lot of people get them. Forget it. Tell me, Robert, seriously. If I decide to stay on here, would you? You could share this apartment. Kieran's grinned. Trying to tempt me, Guy? What a question. Remember, not only are you the most beautiful woman here, but you're the only woman here. Nothing is more essential than a basis for comparison. Adam had no aesthetic sense, or you would have realized that Eve was a pretty haphazard piece of work. You are being frank today. Beatrice stood up and went over to the edge of the pool. She swept her hair back off her forehead with both hands, her long, supple body gleaming against the sunlight. But is there as much urgency as Riggs claims? We've got the cruiser. It's a wreck. The first serious storm will split it open like a rusty can. Nearing noon, the heat on the terrace had become uncomfortable and they left the patio and went indoors. Double Venetian blinds filtered a thin sunlight into the low, wide lounge, and the refrigerated air was cool and soothing. Beatrice stretched out on a long, pale blue elephant hide sofa, one hand playing with the fleecy pile of the carpet. The apartment had been one of her grandfather's pied-à-terres, and Beatrice's home since her parents' death shortly after her birth. She had been brought up under the supervision of the grandfather, who had been a lonely, eccentric tycoon. The source of his wealth Kerens had never established. When he asked Beatrice, shortly after he and Riggs stumbled upon her penthouse Erie, she replied succinctly, let's say he was in money, and a great patron of the arts in his earlier days. His taste leaned particularly towards the experimental and bizarre, and Kerens wondered how far his personality and its strange internal perspectives had been carried forward into his granddaughter. Over the mantelpiece was a huge painting by the early 20th century surrealist Delvaux, in which ashen-faced women danced naked to the waist, with dandified skeletons in tuxedos against a spectral, bone-like landscape. On another wall, one of Max Ernst's self-devouring phantasmagoric jungles screamed silently to itself, like the sump of some insane unconscious. For a few moments, Kieran stared quietly at the dim yellow annulus of Ernst's sun glowering through the exotic vegetation, a curious feeling of memory and recognition signaling through his brain. Far more potent than the Beethoven, the image of the archaic sun burned against his mind, illuminating the fleeting shadows that darted fitfully through its profoundest deeps. Beatrice, she looked up at him as he walked across to her, a light frown crossing her eyes. What's the matter, Robert? Kieran hesitated, suddenly aware that, however brief and imperceptible, a moment of significant time had elapsed, carrying him forward with its passage into a zone of commitment from which he would not be able to withdraw. You realise that if we let Riggs go without us, we don't merely leave here later, we stay.